November 2nd, 1942. Within his command post, somewhere across the vast expanse of the Egyptian desert, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel studied the directive from Hitler for a third time. His hands, though steady, betrayed the tension in his set jaw. The British Eighth Army had breached his defensive lines at El Alamein. His Africa Corps was in a full-scale withdrawal. Fuel reserves were critically depleted. Ammunition was perilously scarce, and Hitler's dispatch commanded him to hold his ground, to surrender not 1 inch of territory, to achieve victory or face annihilation. Rommel remained in profound silence for an extended period. Around him, his staff officers awaited his decision. Outside, the sounds of retreat continued unabated. Trucks laboring westward, wounded soldiers moaning, the distant rumble of British artillery growing ever nearer. He had previously sought authorization for an organized withdrawal to preserve his army. Hitler's response made it unequivocally clear that such permission would be withheld. He began to dictate his reply. The words were meticulously chosen, formal, and steeped in military precision. Yet, for anyone who knew Rommel well, the underlying desperation was palpable. His troops had fought to their final bullet at every defensive position they had occupied, holding out until British armor was literally overwhelming their strongholds. The order to stand firm was an impossibility to fulfill. To do so would mean the utter destruction of his entire force. He dispatched the message. Then, he issued the order for the retreat to continue. That singular moment, that exchange of dispatches on November 2nd, heralded the commencement of a 6-month disintegration that would culminate in the capitulation of over 275,000 Axis servicemen in Tunisia. Throughout those 6 months, the responses from the German High Command would expose a stark dichotomy between the grim reality in North Africa and the distorted perceptions in Berlin, a chasm between what field commanders understood as fact and what Hitler was willing to accept. This disparity in perspectives would claim tens of thousands of lives. Hitler's directive to stand fast was not an anomaly. He had previously issued similar commands, most notably during the winter ordeal outside Moscow the preceding year. In that instance, his refusal to permit a retreat had arguably averted a complete strategic collapse. He firmly believed his resolve had preserved the Eastern Front. Now, he expected his will to secure North Africa. However, North Africa was not Russia. The geographical distances differed. The logistical challenges presented a distinct form of catastrophe. And crucially, Rommel's army was not entrenched in winter positions, with any semblance of hope for resupply. It was a mobile contingent in full flight, expending its last reserves of fuel, firing its final rounds of ammunition, pursued by an adversary possessing overwhelming material superiority. None of these critical factors influenced Hitler. In the operations room of his headquarters in East Prussia, North Africa was merely a battle line on a map, a position to be defended, a matter of sheer willpower and unwavering determination. The tangible realities, the fuel gauges registering empty, the supply vessels foundering in the Mediterranean, the actual tactical disposition, these were mere details that obscured the clarity of his strategic vision. Rommel defied the standfast order. He had no alternative. Compliance would have guaranteed the immediate obliteration of his entire command. Therefore, he retreated, dispatching increasingly urgent communiques to justify each strategic pullback, each abandoned position, each 100 kilometers ceded. With every message, he elucidated a clearer picture of impending disaster. The British commanded over 1,000 tanks. Rommel possessed fewer than 30 operational vehicles. The British had an inexhaustible supply of ammunition. Rommel's artillery was rationing its shells. The British possessed ample fuel for unhindered maneuver. Rommel's vehicles were being systematically abandoned once their fuel ran dry. These were not mere excuses. They were irrefutable mathematical certainties. The Afrika Korps was being systematically annihilated by the numbers. In Berlin, the official reaction unfolded in distinct phases, each revealing different facets of German command culture. At the operational level, the officers of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the OKW, comprehended the full implications of Rommel's dispatches instantly. These were seasoned soldiers. They could interpret the tactical landscape. They understood the ramifications of fuel shortages for a mechanized force. They recognized the significance of ammunition scarcity for defensive strongholds. They knew Rommel was describing an army on the verge of disintegration. However, their comprehension did not translate into decisive action. The OKW's mandate was not to formulate strategic decisions. Its purpose was to convey Hitler's directives and to provide the logistical support required for their implementation. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the OKW, was widely recognized throughout the German military as a sycophant, an individual incapable of contradicting Hitler, who would invariably devise justifications for any decision Hitler made. His chief of operations, Alfred Jodl, possessed a more independent mindset, but ultimately proved no more inclined to directly challenge Hitler's judgment. Consequently, the OKW's response was to solicit further information, to scrutinize Rommel's assessments, and to suggest that perhaps the situation was not as dire as Rommel portrayed. They inquired about the potential deployment of Italian units to secure defensive sectors. They proposed tactical adjustments aimed at conserving fuel. They relayed Hitler's unwavering insistence that no ground be yielded. They did everything, in essence, except acknowledge the fundamental truth. The Afrika Korps had been defeated and was in full retreat. At the strategic level, the response was even more profoundly divorced from reality. Hitler's perspective on North Africa was heavily influenced by the broader strategic context of the war. In November of 1942, Germany was fully committed on the Eastern Front, where the Sixth Army was engaged in fierce combat within Stalingrad, and Army Group A was advancing into the Caucasus. These were the campaigns that held Hitler's paramount attention, the ones he believed would determine the ultimate outcome of the war. North Africa was relegated to a secondary theater, significant for national prestige and for safeguarding the southern flank of Fortress Europe, but not deemed decisive. From this viewpoint, Rommel's withdrawal was interpreted as a failure of will rather than a consequence of insurmountable material constraints. Hitler had dispatched Rommel to Africa. Hitler had cultivated Rommel's reputation. Hitler had furnished Rommel with the instruments for victory, or so Hitler erroneously believed. If Rommel was now retreating, it could only be attributed to a lack of determination on Rommel's part to stand and fight. This interpretation was further bolstered by another influential voice within Hitler's Mediterranean command structure, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Kesselring held the position of Commander-in-Chief South, overseeing all German forces in the Mediterranean theater. He was a naturally optimistic individual, a former Luftwaffe officer who subscribed to the belief that sheer determination and aggressive action could surmount material disadvantages. Critically, Kesselring was not on the ground in the desert, witnessing his tanks run out of fuel. He was in Rome, poring over maps, receiving reports filtered through multiple command echelons, and diligently maintaining diplomatic relations with the Italians. Kesselring's assessments consistently diverged from Rommel's. Where Rommel reported catastrophic fuel shortages, Kesselring suggested that improved logistical management could ameliorate the situation. Where Rommel described overwhelming British superiority, Kesselring highlighted defensive positions that could be held. Where Rommel requested authorization to withdraw to Libya or even Tunisia, Kesselring advocated for resolute engagement and combat. Hitler favored Kesselring's assessments. They aligned with his preconceived notions and desires. They implied that the situation was challenging but not irremediable. They suggested that astute leadership and unwavering resolve could still achieve success. They positioned Rommel's pessimism as the primary problem, rather than a symptom of dire circumstances. This dynamic fostered a peculiar paradox. Rommel on the ground accurately depicted the reality. Kesselring, situated hundreds of miles away, presented a realm of possibility. And Hitler, situated over 1,000 miles away in East Prussia, chose to embrace possibility over reality. The ramifications of this misjudgment unfolded across 1,400 miles of unforgiving desert. Rommel retreated from El Alamein to Fuka, then to Mersa Matruh, and subsequently to Sidi Barrani. Each position was relinquished when escalating British pressure rendered it untenable. He withdrew across the Libyan border, through Bardia, and through Tobruk, the very fortress he had besieged for 8 arduous months in 1941. Now, it was surrendered in a single day. He continued his retreat through Benghazi, through El Agheila, traversing the entire length of Cyrenaica. At each juncture, he formally requested permission for continued withdrawal. At each juncture, Hitler initially refused, only reluctantly conceding when the alternative was encirclement and annihilation. And at each juncture, the discrepancy between Hitler's directives and Rommel's actions widened. The correspondence between Rommel and the High Command during this period vividly illustrates the deteriorating relationship. Rommel's tone shifted from formal military reporting to a barely concealed expression of frustration. He ceased requesting permission and instead began informing headquarters of withdrawals already in progress. He started making decisions based on tactical imperatives rather than strategic orders. Hitler's responses became increasingly sharp. References to duty appeared more frequently. Reminders of the necessity for fanatical resistance were interspersed. Subtly implied was the notion that Rommel's leadership was faltering. The subtext was unequivocal. Hitler was losing confidence in Rommel. However, the situation was on the verge of becoming considerably more complex. On November 8, 1942, a mere 6 days after Rommel commenced his retreat from El Alamein, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch deployed over 100,000 Allied troops into North Africa, with landings staged at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. The entire strategic landscape was irrevocably transformed overnight. Rommel was no longer solely retreating from a numerically superior British force. He was withdrawing towards a second Allied army advancing from the west. North Africa was rapidly evolving into a strategic trap, with Allied forces converging from 2 distinct directions. The German High Command's reaction to Operation Torch exposed the profound depths of their strategic bewilderment. The initial response was one of sheer shock. German intelligence had utterly failed to anticipate the landings, the sheer scale of the operation, the immense distance from which it had been meticulously orchestrated across the Atlantic, and the highly successful deception campaign. All of it caught German command completely by surprise. For several hours, a palpable uncertainty prevailed regarding the unfolding events and their implications. Then, Hitler made a fateful decision that would irrevocably shape the concluding chapter of the North African campaign. Instead of acknowledging that the Axis position in North Africa had become strategically untenable, and instead of attempting to evacuate Rommel's seasoned troops while there was still a window of opportunity, Hitler opted for reinforcement. He ordered troops to be rapidly dispatched to Tunisia. He commanded the Luftwaffe to establish air superiority over the Tunisian coast. He directed the Italian Navy to conduct supply convoys with maximum urgency. He committed to holding North Africa not merely as a temporary defensive maneuver, but as a permanent strategic bastion. The rationale underpinning this decision was multifaceted and vividly illuminated Hitler's strategic thinking at this critical juncture of the war. Tunisia, he contended, presented a different tactical environment compared to the open desert. It boasted mountainous terrain, offering formidable defensive advantages, and ports accessible via relatively short supply routes from Sicily. The Allies would be compelled to assault prepared fortifications rather than engage in open field maneuver. German soldiers, adequately supplied and effectively led, could sustain a defense of Tunisia indefinitely. More importantly, retaining Tunisia would safeguard Sicily and Italy. Should North Africa fall, the Allies would possess a crucial staging ground for an invasion of southern Europe. The entire Mediterranean basin would be imperiled. It was deemed preferable to engage in combat within Tunisia rather than on Sicilian soil or the Italian mainland. There was an inherent logic to this analysis. Tunisia did indeed offer superior defensive topography. The logistical lines originating from Sicily were considerably shorter than the protracted route to Libya, and the imperative to prevent an Allied invasion of southern Europe constituted a legitimate strategic concern. However, this analysis conspicuously disregarded several critical realities. Firstly, it presupposed an adequate supply capacity across the Mediterranean, whereas in reality, Allied air and naval assets were progressively intensifying their attacks, making the crossing increasingly perilous. Secondly, it assumed that newly deployed troops arriving in Tunisia could be effectively equipped and organized, when in fact, they would arrive piecemeal and be thrust into combat without adequate preparation. Thirdly, and most critically, it presupposed that Rommel's retreating Afrika Korps could successfully link up with the newly arrived formations in Tunisia and establish a coherent defensive front. This final assumption necessitated Rommel conducting a fighting withdrawal across the entire breadth of Libya, maintaining unit cohesion, preserving sufficient combat strength to be of value upon arrival in Tunisia, all while being relentlessly pursued by Montgomery's Eighth Army. And with fuel and ammunition reserves reaching critically low levels, Rommel's dispatches during this period adopted a different tenor. He was no longer merely reporting tactical situations. He was issuing dire warnings of strategic catastrophe. His Afrika Korps was disintegrating. Vehicles were being abandoned daily. Units were losing their cohesion. The Italian divisions constituting a significant portion of his command were collapsing, their soldiers surrendering or deserting in alarming numbers. The army that had achieved remarkable victories in 1941 and early 1942 was ceasing to exist as an effective fighting force, and the High Command's response was to instruct him to hasten to Tunisia, where fresh troops were arriving and a new defensive line was to be established. The disconnect had become absolute. Rommel was describing an army on its deathbed. Hitler was planning a campaign. In December of 1942, Rommel's health deteriorated significantly. The relentless strain of the retreat, the profound frustration of dealing with the High Command, the sheer physical exhaustion of continuous combat, all these factors took their toll. He developed severe headaches, circulatory problems, and digestive ailments. His staff observed him becoming increasingly irritable, withdrawn, and less able to concentrate. He formally requested leave to recuperate in Germany. The request was initially denied. The situation was deemed too critical, his presence too vital. However, as his condition worsened, the High Command reluctantly acquiesced. In March of 1943, Rommel departed Africa, officially on sick leave, but in reality, never to return. His absence removed the singular voice that had consistently conveyed the unvarnished truth about North Africa to Hitler. The commanders who succeeded him, first Giovanni Messe for the Italian First Army, and later Hans-Jürgen von Arnim for the 5th Panzer Army, were competent officers. But they lacked Rommel's considerable prestige and his willingness to openly challenge Hitler's directives. Consequently, Hitler's comprehension of the North African situation became even more detached from reality. Throughout March and April of 1943, the Axis position in Tunisia steadily worsened. The Allies intensified their encirclement of the perimeter. Supply convoys from Sicily encountered increasingly devastating air attacks. Fuel shortages reached critical levels. Ammunition stocks dwindled alarmingly. The Luftwaffe lost its hard-won air superiority, and the dispatches emanating from Tunisia to Berlin adopted an increasingly desperate tone. Von Arnim's reports meticulously documented the unfolding collapse in stark, clinical detail. He enumerated the units rendered combat ineffective due to attrition. He provided precise figures detailing fuel consumption versus fuel received. He described the tactical situation in each sector, highlighting the escalating Allied pressure and the strain on defensive lines. Yet he too, mirroring Rommel's predicament, requested authorization for tactical withdrawals, aiming to shorten the defensive perimeter and consolidate forces. And just as Rommel had before him, he received orders to maintain every position, to launch counterattacks, and to uphold an aggressive defense. The pattern had become deeply entrenched within the organizational structure. Field commanders reported the grim reality. The High Command commanded them to alter that reality through sheer force of will. Kesselring's role during this final phase proved particularly significant. He persisted in expressing optimism regarding Tunisia's defensibility, even as the situation became undeniably hopeless. His reports to Hitler consistently emphasized the strength of defensive positions, the arrival of reinforcements, and the perceived difficulties the Allies faced in coordinating their assaults. Some historians have debated whether Kesselring genuinely believed his optimistic assessments, or if he was merely conveying to Hitler what Hitler desired to hear. The available evidence suggests a confluence of both factors. Kesselring was, by his inherent nature, an optimist, inclined to seek out opportunities rather than dwell on obstacles. However, he was also a skilled political operative who adeptly understood how to maintain Hitler's confidence. Regardless of his motivations, his assessments provided Hitler with grounds to continue believing that Tunisia could be held, even as the tactical circumstances rendered this increasingly improbable. By late April of 1943, the end was undeniably approaching. Allied forces had effectively compressed the Axis perimeter into a small, isolated pocket in northeastern Tunisia. Over 250,000 Axis troops found themselves trapped, their backs against the sea, with no possibility of evacuation and no hope of breaking out. The flow of supplies reaching them from Sicily had dwindled to a mere trickle. Fuel was so scarce that tanks were being repurposed as stationary pillboxes. Ammunition was subjected to stringent rationing. Food supplies were nearing depletion. Medical provisions were exhausted. And yet, the directives emanating from Berlin persisted. Hold, fight, resist. On May 6th, the Allies launched their final offensive. British forces advanced towards Tunis from the west. American forces assaulted towards Bizerte from the northwest. French units pressed from the south. The Axis perimeter fractured within days. Von Arnim's final dispatches to Berlin chronicled the complete disintegration. Units were surrendering en masse. Defensive lines were evaporating. Command and control structures were collapsing. The end was imminent. Hitler's response was to order continued resistance. Every position was to be held at all costs. Every man was to fight to the last extremity. Tunisia was to become another Stalingrad, a formidable stronghold designed to tie down Allied forces and demonstrate German resolve. However, Tunisia was not Stalingrad. There was no prospect of relief. There was no possibility of resupply. There was no strategic justification for prolonged resistance beyond delaying the inevitable by a matter of days. On May 13, 1943, the last remaining Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. Over 275,000 men were taken into captivity, including 100,000 Germans. It represented one of the largest surrenders in military history, comparable in scale to the capitulation at Stalingrad just 4 months prior. The reaction in Berlin was one of stunned silence. Hitler had now lost 2 entire armies within a span of 5 months. The 6th Army at Stalingrad in February, and the Afrika Korps, along with its reinforcements in Tunisia in May. Over 500,000 men had been killed or captured. Entire divisions had been effectively erased from the order of battle, and years of invaluable training and materiel had been irretrievably lost. And unlike Stalingrad, where the encircled troops had fought until their absolute destruction, in Tunisia, over 200,000 men surrendered while still possessing the capacity to fight. They capitulated because continued resistance was futile, because they were utterly devoid of supplies, because the situation was irrevocably hopeless. This was the aspect Hitler could not bring himself to accept. In the days following the surrender, Hitler's pronouncements concerning North Africa revealed his particular interpretation of the events that had transpired. He did not acknowledge the fundamental flaws in his strategic planning. He did not concede that his refusal to authorize an evacuation when such an option was feasible had condemned his troops. He did not admit that his insistence on reinforcing Tunisia had merely served to provide the Allies with an increased number of prisoners. Instead, his focus remained fixed on the act of surrender itself. The soldiers had given up. They had not fought to the last man. They had failed to exhibit the fanatical resistance he had so vehemently commanded. The failure, in his view, was not strategic. It was moral. This interpretation would have profound and lasting consequences for the manner in which Hitler prosecuted the remainder of the war. The lesson he extracted from the North African campaign was not the imperative to heed the counsel of his field commanders, nor that tangible realities held significant weight, nor that sheer willpower alone could not surmount insurmountable circumstances. The lesson he internalized was that German soldiers required greater fanaticism, a more profound willingness to die, and a stronger resistance to the temptation of surrender. His standfast orders became more frequent and more absolute. The penalties for unauthorized withdrawal grew increasingly severe. The expectation that units would fight to their complete annihilation became the prevailing standard. North Africa had, in essence, taught Hitler precisely the wrong lesson. For the field commanders, those survivors who had endeavored to communicate the truth and had been consistently ignored, the collapse of North Africa represented a tragic confluence of vindication and devastation. Their assessment of the military predicament had been precise. They had accurately gauged the feasibility of various actions and the limitations imposed upon them. Their attempts to safeguard their soldiers were consistently thwarted at every juncture by a leadership hierarchy that favored comforting fictions over stark truths. Rommel, recuperating in Germany, received news of the ultimate capitulation during a period of convalescence. His response, documented in correspondence and subsequent recollections, was one of embittered acceptance. He had foreseen this outcome. He had cautioned that it was imminent. He had implored authorization for an evacuation while such an option remained viable, only to be disregarded. The 250,000 soldiers who laid down their arms in Tunisia encompassed numerous individuals who had served under his command in the Africa Corps, who had traversed the desert in combat, who had placed their faith in their leader's competence. Now, they were destined to endure the remainder of the conflict in internment camps, not due to battlefield subjugation, but because the Supreme Command had obstinately refused to acknowledge defeat when its acceptance could have preserved them. The divergence between pronouncements from German High Command and its actual knowledge had never been more pronounced than in those concluding months of the North African campaign. Dispatches originating from Tunisia painted a grim picture of catastrophe. Directives dispatched from Berlin mandated the impossible, and in the interim, thousands perished or were taken into custody because those formulating strategic decisions declined to heed the intelligence provided by those engaged in combat. This became a recurring motif, manifesting with minor alterations across all theaters of war for the duration of the conflict. The Eastern Front, the Western Front, the Italian theater, and the ultimate struggle for Germany itself all bore witness to this identical dynamic. Frontline commanders reporting untenable circumstances, High Command issuing directives for unattainable solutions, and servicemen succumbing in the chasm between actuality and dogma. North Africa served as the crucible where this pattern was irrevocably forged, where the mechanisms of self-delusion and intentional ignorance became entrenched at the uppermost echelons of German military leadership. The statements issued by German High Command upon the collapse of North Africa revealed not merely their reaction to a military setback, but the profound systemic failing that would define German strategic planning for the remainder of the war. They ordered a stand when a retreat was imperative. They commanded engagement when surrender was unavoidable. They proclaimed victory when defeat was assured, and they persisted in these declarations, continued to issue these orders, and kept demanding these impossibilities, even as the evidence accumulated that their words had utterly detached from the reality confronting their troops. This was the discourse of German High Command when North Africa crumbled. And this is precisely why the subsequent collapse proved so far more calamitous than it needed to have been.